Welcome to Legacy Black of Power. 19 Black R&B legends who became the worst drug addicts Part 2, then and now 2025. On February 11th, 2012, the world stopped in shock. Whitney Houston, the voice of a generation, was found lifeless in a Hollywood hotel bathtub. Addiction isn't just a shadow lurking in back alleys or broken neighborhoods. It stalks the glittering mansions of the rich and famous just as ruthlessly. Think legends are untouchable? Think again. In truth, they're often the most vulnerable. Fame brings applause, fortune, and adoration. But behind the curtain lies crushing loneliness and unbearable pressure. You don't need to come from the slums to spiral into ruin. Even those draped in designer gowns, stepping out of limousines, can lose everything in a single fragile moment. One misstep, one desperate choice, and suddenly, addiction sinks its claws in, dragging them into a darkness that even stardom can't outshine. It doesn't just destroy the body. It erases reputations, careers, and legacies, leaving only shattered souls where once legends stood tall. If you're still with us, drop a number 1 in the comments to stand with this story. Because in today's video, we'll uncover the tragic downfall of 19 R&B icons, stars who once soared at the peak of glory, only to be devoured by the same merciless monster. Some left this world in agony. Others survived, but live today as shadows of the greatness they once embodied. David Ruffin, the voice that couldn't save him. David Ruffin, the golden voice behind My Girl, was discovered slumped in the back of a stranger's car, his veins wrecked by cocaine. Once the magnetic frontman of the Temptations, Motown's crown jewel, Ruffin had risen from obscurity to superstardom almost overnight. In 1965, his husky, soul-soaked vocals carried My Girl to the top of the Billboard charts. Tall, handsome, and blessed with a voice that could freeze time, Ruffin looked destined to reign forever. But behind that dazzling spotlight was a man quietly unraveling under the very fame he had dreamed of. He joined the Temptations in 1964, and within 2 years, the group was unstoppable, turning out classics like Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Beauty is Only Skin Deep, and I Know I'm Losing You. Yet success came at a crushing price. Ruffin became obsessed with perfection. Terrified of losing his gift and his spot in the group, he barely slept. To keep going, he leaned on cocaine, first as fuel, then as a lifeline, and finally as the poison that consumed him. By 1966, the cracks began to show. On stage, he lashed out. Off stage, he spiraled into psychotic episodes. In 1968, after demanding the group be renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations, he was fired. His downfall was loud and public. He would storm stages uninvited, snatching microphones mid-performance, convinced he was a true star. His solo career stumbled, albums tanked, contract evaporated, and arrests for cocaine mounted in 1972 and 1975. Even when a comeback seemed within reach in the early 80s, addiction pulled him back under. By 1985, David Ruffin was a shadow of himself. Once adored by millions, he was reduced to $250 gigs in community halls. He drifted through cheap motels, abandoned by record labels, estranged from family, and left behind by friends. The man who had once embodied Motown's magic now wandered like a ghost. On May 31st, 1991, he cut one last recording with his old friend Eddie Kendricks. Paid just $40, he slipped away into the night. Witnesses later said he binged on cocaine without food or rest. By dawn, he was found unconscious in a dealer's car. Dumped at the curb of a University of Pennsylvania hospital, he was left to die alone. When he passed, David Ruffin had no ID, no fanfare, only $53 in his wallet. His body went unclaimed until fingerprints revealed the truth. 3 days later, his family was finally notified. No headline screamed. No grand farewell was staged. One of Motown's brightest stars slipped from this world like a stranger. He gave us My Girl, a song that still stops hearts and fills dance floors. But in the end, David Ruffin left without applause, without a song, without a stage. Only silence. Frankie Lymon, the teenage prodigy who lit up America and died with needles still in his hand. At just 13 years old, this skinny kid from Harlem shook the nation to its core. His hit, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, soared to the top of the Billboard charts, turning him into an overnight sensation. With that angelic voice, electric dance moves, and mischievous sparkle in his eyes, Frankie wasn't just entertainment. He was a revolution. For the first time, white America sat in awe, watching a young black boy command the stage on national television. Frankie didn't just sing songs. He shattered barriers. But the rise was too fast. By 14, Frankie had walked away from the teenagers. Behind the fame, there was no steady hand, no parent, no mentor, just a boy forced to navigate stardom alone. He signed his own contracts, carried his own suitcase, bought his own flashy suits. Then came heroin. At 15, Frankie was shooting up every day. His body began to break down before his talent could even bloom. His teeth rotted, his skin darkened, and that once heavenly voice slowly disappeared. By 1961, police found him skeletal, broken, syringes stuffed in his pockets. Rehab sparked hope, but the cycle of drugs, nightclubs, and loneliness kept dragging him back under. Love didn't save him either. 3 marriages in 3 years, only 1 legal. His last wife, Zola Taylor, lost their baby, and Frankie never recovered from the grief. By late 1967, the boy who once ruled the stage had vanished from it completely. Then came February 28, 1968, a glimmer of hope. Frankie had just signed a new record deal and told a friend he was ready to celebrate. That night, inside his foster mother's Harlem home, he locked himself in a room, pulled out a bag of nearly pure heroin, and injected it. Minutes later, he collapsed on the cold wooden floor. The next morning, his foster mother opened the door. Frankie lay motionless, the syringe still clutched in his hand. He was only 25 years old. No farewell, no glory, buried in an unmarked Bronx grave. The world barely noticed as a crown slipped from the boy once hailed as king. A child who once made America sing with silence forever, in shadows, in silence, in tragedy. So tell me, do stories like Frankie's break your heart, or do they expose the brutal truth of fame? Drop a 1 in the comments if you want more untold stories like this. If not, hit us with a 3 below. Sly Stone, the funk genius who once lit up the world, only to fade into the shadows of a beat-up RV. He was a mastermind behind Everyday People, Dance to the Music, and a flood of hits that forever changed American music. With Sly and the Family Stone, he led the first interracial band to break through racial barriers on a national stage. By the early 70s, he was untouchable, an icon worshipped by Miles Davis, James Brown, and an entire generation. Fame, fortune, power, Sly had it all. And then, almost overnight, it slipped through his fingers. By 1971, after releasing There's a Riot Going On, Sly was completely drained. The songs stopped flowing. Days blurred into nights as he sat at the piano, pounding the keys, screaming into empty rooms after 3 straight days without sleep. That's when his manager handed him a small bag of cocaine. 1 hit, and suddenly, for songs spilled out. The second time, he stayed at the piano for 3 days straight. From that moment, the hook was in deep. By 1973, every concert was a gamble. Fans never knew if Sly would show up or stumble in hours late, hidden behind dark glasses, muttering through paranoia, a gun in his hand, barely holding himself together. By 1975, the band had collapsed. Sly sank further, swapping cocaine for PCP, a drug that convinced him the FBI was tracking his every move and that his drum machine could talk back. Between 1980 and 1987, he was arrested 26 times for everything from assault to driving without a license. In one infamous moment, he rolled into court in pajamas, sunglasses, and a fake wheelchair, shouting, "Funk is not a crime." By 1993, Sly disappeared. For 14 years, nothing. When he resurfaced in 2007, the sight was heartbreaking. He was living in a crumbling RV in Los Angeles with no electricity, no running water, no family. He survived on a single loaf of bread stretched over days, stealing power from a laundromat just to charge his wheelchair. Inside that broken RV sat a bag of drugs, a battered guitar, and a man who had once sold 30 million records. By 2011, his net worth had dropped below $100. 3 decades had passed without a true comeback. And when asked if he would ever perform again, Sly Stone whispered just 5 haunting words: "I've already gone." Rick James. Rick James wasn't just a star. He was a firestorm, devouring himself in cocaine, violence, and delusion. The undisputed king of funk, he didn't merely revive Motown. He ripped it apart and rebuilt it on his own wild terms. With Street Songs, Rick unleashed a sound that was raw, reckless, and dripping with sex and swagger. He wrote it, lived it, and broke every rule in sight. But the very fire that made him a legend would soon burn him alive. By 1981, Rick stood on the highest peak of fame. Yet at that summit, he chained himself to cocaine, snorting lines every 20 minutes just to keep moving. The genius that had fueled his rise became his cage. Within 2 years, $1 million had vanished up his nose. His studio turned into a circus of paranoia and hallucination, walls breathing, colors twisting to his moods. He canceled tours. He surrounded himself with 24 women bound by contracts to serve his every demand. Rage came fast. One late manager found a gun in his face, only for Rick to laugh minutes later, toss him cash, and call it love. The line between reality and madness had shattered. Only cocaine felt real. And then came the crimes. In 1991, Rick kidnapped a woman, slashed her face, burned her skin, and forced drugs down her throat, calling the torment art. 2 years later, another victim was bound in tape. Her hair hacked away as Rick cackled with manic delight. Finally, the law caught up. The courts ended his reign of terror, sentencing him to more than 5 years behind bars. When he walked out, he wasn't Rick James anymore. His memory was broken. His heart raced uncontrollably. His lungs were charred black. He couldn't even remember his own son's birthday. The call stopped. No tours. No albums. No stage. On August 6th, 2004, Rick James died slumped on a couch in a rented apartment. 9 different drugs churned through his blood. Enough to kill a horse. No spotlight. No screaming crowd. Just silence. The man who once set the world ablaze had burned himself down to ashes. Ike Turner. Ike Turner, a name once hailed as the king of R&B. But behind the crown was pure chaos. Drugs, paranoia, and violence ate him alive. He wasn't just a musician. He was a force of nature. In 1951, his track Rocket 88 lit the fuse of rock and roll, a blast that shaped the sound of generations. Songwriter, producer, guitarist, bandleader, Ike laid the foundation for music trends that still ripple today. But the higher he climbed, the further he spiraled into darkness. By the late 60s, Ike leaned on cocaine just to keep pace with his punishing schedule. What started as a pick-me-up turned into survival. From 1974 to 1985, he blew through $500 to $1,000 a day, snorting at sunrise, smoking before shows, injecting between takes. Sometimes he stayed wired for an entire week, his nerves wound as tight as his guitar strings. The higher he got, the more unhinged he became. In his mind, he was still the ruler of his band, of Tina of the world. Paranoia took over. He boarded up studio windows, convinced the CIA was spying through beams of sunlight. He wired his house with cameras and stalked the halls at night with a gun in hand. Sometimes he'd force his bandmates to stand motionless for hours, certain someone was plotting to betray him. And through it all, Tina carried the brunt of his fury. On stage, he humiliated her by yanking off her wig in front of thousands. Backstage, he smashed a mic box into her face, leaving her with 16 stitches and no voice to scream. She knew that if she cried out, he'd choke her in their hotel room later that night. Their 19-year marriage was built on bruises. Over 50 beatings, 2 hospital stays, and countless nights dragged across the floor by her hair. The breaking point came in July 1976 at the Statler Hilton in Dallas. After Ike smashed her with a boot heel, Tina ran, her face swollen, dress torn, clutching only 36 cents and a mobile gas card. She never looked back. By 1987, police had raided Ike's home 3 times in 3 months, seizing 300 grams of cocaine, 2 guns, and blood-stained crack pipes. He spent 18 months in prison, but bars couldn't break his addiction. Rehab was a revolving door. 15 stints in 20 years, none successful. When he appeared on TV in 2004, he was just a shadow of the man who once shook the world. His face was scarred, his hands trembled, his eyes were hollow. Even he barely recognized himself. 3 years later, Ike Turner was gone, his body ravaged, heart and lungs shredded by decades of cocaine. The coroner's report was brutal. Severe drug abuse, a heart destroyed by toxins. There was no funeral, no public memorial. Tina's only words were as sharp as they were final. I don't mourn him. I mourn the man he could have been. R. Kelly, a musical titan devoured by power, drugs, and his own demons. Once crowned the undisputed king of R&B, he sold more than 75 million records worldwide. He gave us timeless anthems like I Believe I Can Fly and Ignition remix, songs that became the soundtrack of an era. To millions, he wasn't just an artist. He was an icon, a genius whose voice and pen shaped the sound of American music for over 2 decades. But behind the blinding stage lights, a nightmare was quietly unfolding. Money, fame, and addiction built a fortress that concealed years of abuse, manipulation, and corruption. Growing up in the rough streets of Southside Chicago, Kelly himself had been a victim, enduring sexual abuse at the hands of family members. No one protected him. No one intervened. Hardened by trauma, he buried his pain deep inside. His only escape? Music, and later, drugs. The first pills surfaced in the late 80s as he began his climb with public announcement. But success hit too fast, too hard. By the mid-90s, he was dependent. Cocaine, MDMA, Xanax, consumed like daily meals. On stage, they kept him alive. Off stage, they twisted his mind into delusions of total control. Inside his sprawling 17,000-square-foot Chicago mansion, Kelly created an empire of terror. 6 to 10 underage girls lived under strict command. No phones, no freedom, no contact with the outside world. Their existence revolved entirely around his rules. High as often as 4 days a week, he forced them into degrading, violent acts that left permanent scars. Some would never be able to have children again. The FBI later unearthed horrors that defied belief. One victim recalled carving his name into a bathroom wall with her own blood, a desperate scream for help that went unheard. For more than 15 years, R. Kelly ruled like a tyrant, shielded by fame and addiction. Then came the reckoning. In 2017, the hashtag Mute R. Kelly movement erupted. Allegations stacked up like a storm. From 2018 to 2021, his empire crumbled. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, stripped of royalties, and buried under $37 million in lawsuits. Record labels erased his name as if he had never existed. In prison, the once mighty star withered. Depressed, sedated, and locked away for his own safety, he drifted into silence. Some days he sat for hours, whispering fragments of old songs, like a ghost haunted by his own lyrics. Drugs hadn't just destroyed his body, they had hollowed out his soul. R. Kelly's story is no longer about stardom. It's a chilling downfall of a man consumed by his demons. A reminder how fame can mask the darkest sins until it all comes crashing down. Sean John Combs. Sean Diddy Combs wasn't just a music mogul. He was an empire in motion. The genius behind Bad Boy Records. He turned street dreams into platinum realities, built a billion-dollar dynasty, and crowned himself the king of cool. Fashion icon, entrepreneur, cultural architect. For more than 20 years, he seemed untouchable, larger than life. But behind the flashing lights was a different story. An empire built not only on music, but on lust, fear, and an insatiable hunger for control. From the moment Bad Boy was born in the 90s, Combs plunged into a world of endless nights. Cocaine lined across glass tables, ecstasy capsules passed like candy, champagne flowing like water. It wasn't just partying, it was power theater. He fed on it all, not only the high, but the submission in every stare, the control over every heartbeat in the room. Friends whispered he lived on paranoia and stimulants, burning through 3 grams of cocaine a night, drowned in liquor just to stay standing. By the 2000s, his reach stretched far beyond music. Fashion lines, film ventures, luxury liquor brands. But with each empire came another shadow. His sprawling mansions weren't homes. They were stages. Lavish parties in Los Angeles weren't celebrations. They were traps. Phones were confiscated. Models and artists, sometimes barely of age, were locked away from the outside world. Behind soundproof walls, drugs, cameras, and fear became his tools of domination. The media still praised the bad boy brand, but by 2019, the cracks began to show. Whispers turned into accusations, silence with payouts and threats. Victims claimed they were drugged, filmed without consent, and blackmailed with the evidence. The truth lurked in the shadows until 2024, when the empire finally collapsed. The FBI stormed his estates, seizing phones, hard drives, bricks of cocaine. Over 50 women stepped into the light. Graphic evidence surfaced. Allies fled. Contracts dissolved. Bank accounts froze. The bad boy, Kingpin, was stripped of his crown. Arrested and charged with trafficking, extortion, and weaponizing drugs as shackles of control, the verdict sealed his fall. 15 years behind bars. The very drugs that once fueled his rise devoured him whole, corroding his empire, his sanity, and his legacy. In a matter of months, Sean Combs went from music royalty to cautionary tale, proof that power, when poisoned by greed, always rots from within. James Brown, the one and only godfather of soul, wasn't just a performer, he was a storm, a man who clawed his way up from nothing, then set the world on fire with his volcanic voice, electrifying footwork, and raw, unstoppable energy. He didn't just sing funk, he invented it, reshaping the very DNA of soul music forever. With timeless hits like I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, he ruled the stage like a king, worshipped by millions who saw him as untouchable. But behind the dazzling lights and deafening applause, a far darker reality was unfolding. By the late 1960s, as his fame soared higher than ever, Brown's life was spinning out of control. The endless grind of touring, crushing debts, and the burden of running an empire left him restless, paranoid, and desperate. To keep the fire burning, he reached for cocaine, and later, PCP. What started as fuel for performances quickly morphed into shackles, stripping away his control and dragging him into madness. By the mid-1980s, the godfather of soul was no longer the man the world once adored. Addiction twisted him into someone unrecognizable, volatile, violent, and tormented. He barricaded himself in rooms with drugs and guns, raged through sleepless nights, and unleashed terrifying fury on his wife Adrienne, who ended up in the hospital more than once. To his band and staff, he was either a genius or a madman, depending on the day. Then came 1988, the breaking point. In a haze of drugs and paranoia, Brown stormed into an insurance meeting with a shotgun, convinced they were plotting against him. What followed was a high-speed chase across 2 states, with police in pursuit as Brown, sweaty, trembling, and incoherent, tried to outrun his demons. When he was finally cornered, his body was flooded with cocaine. The man who once seemed immortal was sentenced to prison, his godlike image shattered. Released in 1991, Brown fought to reclaim his throne. But years of abuse had taken a brutal toll. His body was frail, his nerves shattered, and the mighty voice that once shook arenas now trembled like a fragile whisper. In his final years, he withdrew from the spotlight, still haunted by arrests, scandals, and violent outbursts, a fading shadow of the legend he once was. On December 25th, 2006, James Brown, the man who gave the world rhythm, fire, and soul, took his last breath at 73. Decades of addiction, depression, and relentless pressure had broken his body. It was a cruel ending for a man who gave everything to the stage, a legend consumed by the same chaos that once fueled his genius. Etta James, the rise and fall of an R&B legend. Etta James wasn't just a singer. She was a force of nature. With unforgettable hits like At Last and Tell Mama, she didn't just perform. She commanded the stage, pouring thunder, soul, and fire into every note. Millions were spellbound by her voice, but behind the spotlight lived a woman wrestling with demons that fame could never silence. Born into poverty in Los Angeles, Etta's childhood was marked by abandonment, abuse, and violence. Music became her sanctuary, the only place she could pour out the ache and loneliness that defined her early years. Her gift lifted her into stardom, but fame carried a heavy cost. Pressures mounted, and Etta sought relief in heroin, a dangerous escape that quickly dragged her into darkness. By 1969, addiction had nearly destroyed her. Arrests stacked up, contracts vanished, and the world that once crowned her a queen of soul now turned its back. Through the 1970s, she slipped deeper into poverty, chasing her next fix as her career crumbled around her. But Etta James was no stranger to fighting. In the 1980s, she clawed her way back, battling addiction and slowly rebuilding her life. Her resilience reignited her career, yet the scars never truly faded. The years of struggle left her body frail, even as her spirit remained unbreakable. When Etta James passed away in 2012, she left behind more than music. She left a legacy carved out of pain, power, and perseverance. Her voice still echoes, timeless and defiant, reminding the world that even legends bleed. Behind every song was a soul that refused to be forgotten. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston wasn't just a singer. She was a golden girl of music, a force of nature whose voice could move mountains and bring the world to tears. With timeless hits like I Will Always Love You, she didn't just dominate the charts. She became the heartbeat of a generation. But behind the glittering spotlight and standing ovations, a darker story was slowly unraveling, one that would transform her brilliance into heartbreak. Born into a dynasty of music royalty, Whitney seemed destined for greatness. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a gospel legend, and her cousins, Dionne and Dee Dee Warwick, had already made their mark. From the moment Whitney stepped into the industry in the mid-1980s, she was unstoppable. She shattered records, raised the bar higher than anyone before her, and redefined what it meant to be a global superstar. Yet the price of carrying that torch, the weight of expectations, the suffocating demands of fame and private battles at home, began pushing her into dangerous territory. Her 1992 marriage to Bobby Brown only fueled the chaos. What began as a high-profile union quickly descended into turmoil. Addiction took center stage in their lives, and drugs became Whitney's escape from the relentless pressure surrounding her. By the late 90s, the damage was impossible to ignore. Her once flawless, angelic voice, her greatest gift, began to falter. The soaring notes that once electrified the world grew fragile, cracked, and sometimes disappeared altogether. Fans who had once cheered her brilliance now watched in sorrow as she gasped for breath, missed notes, and struggled to hold on to glory that defined her. By 2009, during what was meant to be her triumphant comeback tour, the cracks had become chasms. In Vancouver, she stumbled, forgot lyrics, and failed to finish songs. The crowd's boos were a cruel confirmation. The golden voice that had once seemed untouchable was slipping away, and so was a career that had made her a legend. Then came the unthinkable. On February 11th, 2012, just hours before the Grammy Awards, Whitney Houston was found lifeless in her bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. She was only 48. The autopsy revealed a tragic cocktail of cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, and sedatives. Her body, weakened by years of abuse, simply couldn't fight anymore. The woman who had given the world its greatest love songs drowned alone in silence. It was a chilling and heartbreaking end for one of music's brightest stars. Whitney Houston's story remains one of the greatest tragedies in entertainment history, a haunting reminder that even the most dazzling lights can be consumed by darkness. Bobby Brown. Bobby Brown's life is a tale of brilliance, heartbreak, and a fall that seemed almost written in the stars. In the late 80s, he was unstoppable, a pioneer of New Jack Swing whose swagger and raw talent electrified dance floors with anthems like My Prerogative and the record-breaking Don't Be Cruel. He was young, fearless, and burning so bright that an entire generation moved to his rhythm. But behind the fame, shadows crept closer. The cracks began when Bobby turned to drugs. Growing up in the violence and poverty of Boston left scars that success could never erase. The pressure of fame only deepened those wounds, and soon cocaine, heroin, and alcohol became his escape. Even his high-profile marriage to Whitney Houston, a union once painted as a fairy tale, turned into a shared descent, dragging them both into chaos. By the early 90s, Bobby's unraveling was no longer a secret. Headlines that once celebrated his music now documented arrests for drunk driving, disorderly conduct, and reckless behavior. His voice, once commanding, grew shaky under the weight of addiction. The arenas that had once roared for him fell silent. His name began fading from the marquees. Then came 2012. Whitney was gone, and with her death, Bobby's world collapsed even further. Addiction still gripped him like a vice, hope slipping further from reach. What remained was a haunting picture. A man who once had it all, standing as a broken reflection of shattered dreams. Bobby Brown became the embodiment of a tragic truth, that even the brightest stars can burn out too soon, leaving behind only memories, sorrow, and regret. Wilson Pickett. Wilson Pickett wasn't just a singer. He was a force of nature. A soul powerhouse who set the 60s and 70s ablaze with raw fire, searing passion, and timeless anthems like In the Midnight Hour and Land of 10,000 Dances. He had a voice that could stop you in your tracks, a sound that defined an era. On stage, he seemed larger than life, untouchable, a living legend. But behind the spotlight, his story carried shadows just as powerful as his music, a journey that spiraled from triumph into torment. He started with unshakable confidence, never imagining that the gift of fame could one day feel like a curse. By the mid-1970s, the world of music was shifting, and Pickett felt it slipping from his grasp. The weight of racial prejudice, rejection, and a relentless demand to stay relevant began to crush his spirit. To numb the pain, he reached for cocaine and alcohol, companions that promised comfort but only pulled him deeper into darkness. By 1988, the world no longer saw the fiery soul star who once made crowds erupt in dance. Instead, headlines captured a broken man, arrested for drunk driving, stumbling through flashing cameras, his golden image shattered. What was left was a haunting shadow of the legend he once was. In 2006, his heart finally gave out. The very vices that promised escape had already carved their damage, leaving scars that no stage lights could hide. His voice, however, lives forever, etched into the soundtrack of a generation. Yet his life remains a sobering reminder. Even the brightest flames can be consumed by their own fire, fading into silence long before their time. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye, a voice drenched in velvet, yet haunted by storms within. He wasn't just a soul singer. He was the very heartbeat of the 60s and 70s, the man who gifted us timeless anthems like What's Going On in Sexual Healing. But behind the stage lights and adoring crowds, his world was quietly falling apart. The unraveling began in 1970 with a heartbreak he never recovered from, the death of his closest friend and duet partner, Tammy Terrell. Her loss carved a hole in his spirit. Depression soon took hold, and cocaine became his nightly refuge, a poison that stole his brilliance piece by piece. Once electric performances turned erratic, his health collapsed, and the radiant glow that defined him began to fade. On top of addiction, financial ruin closed in. A staggering $9.2 million tax debt left him cornered. While at home, his already volatile relationship with his domineering father grew more explosive by the day. Marvin's life became a storm of chaos, conflict, and despair that no song could soothe. Then came April 1st, 1984, the day the music died. In the heat of yet another argument, Marvin's father pulled the trigger. At just 44 years old, a voice that once pleaded for peace was silenced by violence. The world was left grieving not only a legend, but also the tragedy of a man whose soul carried both beauty and unbearable pain. Chaka Khan. Chaka Khan, the undisputed queen of R&B, wasn't just a singer. She was a storm wrapped in silk and fire. In the 1970s and 80s, her career erupted with timeless anthems like I Feel For You and Through the Fire, placing her firmly among music's brightest consolations. But while the stage lights made her shimmer, a much darker storm brewed behind the curtain. Beneath the glamour, Chaka wrestled with the suffocating weight of sexism, racism, and the brutal grind of the music business. To quiet the pain, she turned to cocaine and heroin. By the early 80s, drugs weren't just an escape, they had become her lifeline. The once electric powerhouse began to dim. Studio sessions went unattended, concerts stumbled, and even her legendary voice, the gift that crowned her, started to falter. By the middle of the decade, the woman who had once ruled the charts was buried under $2 million in debt. Her fortune had evaporated into powders, needles, and endless parties. The radiant star was fading fast, trapped in a lonely battle with her own demons. And yet, Chaka Khan refused to disappear. Out of the wreckage came a flicker of resilience. Recovery was grueling, marked by painful setbacks and shadows that never fully vanished. But piece by piece, she fought her way back, reclaiming her strength, her voice, and her rightful throne. In the end, Chaka Khan became more than a survivor. She stood as living proof that even in life's darkest storms, the light of music and the fire of the human spirit can burn brighter than ever. Mary J. Blige. Mary J. Blige, the undisputed queen of hip-hop soul, wasn't just singing songs. She was bearing her soul with every note. When she stormed on the scene in 1992 with What's a 411, her voice lit the industry on fire, raw, vulnerable, and unshakably powerful. But while her music soared, her personal life was unraveling behind the spotlight. Fame hit fast and hard in the early 90s, and Mary sought refuge in alcohol and cocaine, trying to numb the wounds of a childhood scarred by poverty and violence. What began as a way to cope soon became a trap. Millions vanished into bottles and lines. Concerts grew chaotic. Interviews turned slurred, and fans watched in shock as their idol battled demons that refused to stay hidden. Debts piled up, and whispers of her downfall became headlines. By 1997, Mary broke her silence, admitting to the world that she was fighting addiction. But healing wasn't instant. It took years of setbacks, struggles, and sheer determination before she truly began to climb back in 2001. Slowly, painfully, she rebuilt her health, her faith, her voice. By the mid-2000s, she emerged sober and unbreakable, her story stitched into every lyric she sang. Still, the fire of her early years carried a haunting truth. Her later albums were filled with heart and wisdom, but never quite the same blazing intensity that came from pain she once lived through daily. Mary J. Blige's journey remains both triumphant and tragic, a legend's crown gleaming on the outside, while inside, battles rage that no spotlight could ever erase. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway, a musical genius whose gift was as radiant as it was fragile. In the early 1970s, his voice was heaven-sent, carrying a depth of soul that could break your heart and heal it in the same breath. With his debut album, Everything is Everything, Donny ascended to the heights of R&B, hailed as one of the purest voices of his generation. But the higher his star rose, the darker the demons lurking in the shadows became. By 1973, the music inside his head was drowned out by whispers, distorted, relentless, terrifying. Doctors called it paranoid schizophrenia. The pills they prescribed silenced more than the voices. They dulled his genius, robbed him of memory, slowed his reflexes, and dimmed the light in his spirit. Struggling to endure, Donny turned to stimulants, alcohol, and heavy drugs, chasing relief in all the wrong places. His paranoia deepened. He spent fortunes on electronics, bodyguards, and narcotics, convinced the CIA was plotting to abduct him. The studio, once a sanctuary, became a battlefield. He smashed microphones, yanked out wires, and shouted that unseen forces were draining his energy. Friends pulled away. The music slowed to a standstill. Between 1976 and 1978, he managed only 2 live performances, each collapsing into chaos. Then came January 12, 1979. Donny entered a New York studio with Roberta Flack, set to record a duet that might have marked his triumphant return. Instead, for 5 long hours, the session spiraled. He unplugged gear, knocked over stands, and cried out in fear that invisible powers were stealing his soul. Roberta begged him to rest. The session ended in heartbreak. Just after 2 a.m., a body was discovered on the sidewalk outside the Essex House Hotel. Donny Hathaway had fallen from the 15th floor. No struggle, no note, only a torn prescription and a handful of unidentified pills. The divine voice that once lifted millions was gone, snatched away in silence. And with it remains the haunting question. Was Donny Hathaway consumed by madness, or was he simply trying to escape a world too heavy for even his extraordinary soul to bear? DeBarge. DeBarge, an angelic voice swallowed by the storm of heroin. In the 1980s, he soared as an R&B icon, delivering timeless hits like Rhythm of the Night His falsetto felt otherworldly, a gift that seemed to pour straight from heaven. But behind that flawless sound was a boy scarred by abuse and poverty, a man carrying wounds too deep for the spotlight to ever truly heal. When the family group DeBarge split in 1986, L's unraveling began. Heroin and cocaine became his nightly ritual, burning through millions as he spent nearly $2,000 a week just to keep going. Alone in dim hotel rooms, with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, he didn't shoot up to escape reality. He did it just to summon enough strength to sing another note. By 1992, the law caught up with him. Arrested for drug possession, it was the first of 13 arrests that followed. 3 trips to rehab failed him. Prison broke him further. The superstar who once filled arenas was reduced to couch surfing at relatives' homes, sleeping on studio floors, and weighing barely 110 pounds. Torn clothes clung to his frail frame. His breath reeked of chemicals, and the world had already moved on from the golden voice it once adored. And L wasn't suffering alone. All 5 of his siblings were locked in the same war with addiction, many never making it back. By 2001, L. DeBarge had fallen from the heights of fame to the pits of ruin. Then in 2010, he tried to rise again with an album fittingly titled Second Chance. But for many, it was too late. The world had turned the page. The title carried a bitter irony, because what he sang no longer sounded like rebirth. It was a cry of a broken man who once had it all, pleading for redemption that never came. And that's the cruel truth about so many R&B legends. Men who once ruled the stage now wander in the shadows of regret. Their voices silenced, their dreams shattered. Addiction doesn't care how great the talent. It destroys without mercy. So, what do you think? Do these stories prove that even the brightest stars can fall? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more raw truths hidden behind Hollywood's glittering spotlight.